Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Suerie. I'm co-director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you in this session, in this webinar, where we'll be asking what next for the global governance of COVID-19, and in particular, what happened at the WHO Executive Board special session, which was dedicated to COVID-19, and it took place just earlier this week on Monday and Tuesday. We have a really excellent set of speakers here to share some of their reflections and their insights with all of us today. Just before I introduce each of them, I'd like to make sure everybody has a clear picture of how we'll be spending our next hour together. I'll introduce our speakers. I'll offer a few very brief comments on what is the Executive Board. And then we'll be asking all of you, in fact, to share some of your early thoughts with us through a poll. It's the first time we're doing this in one of our webinars, so I hope that you'll participate. We'll have about 25 minutes of discussion back and forth with our panelists before opening the floor to your questions. Feel free to enter your questions at the bottom of the screen anytime during the webinar. We'll be turning to those at about past. Once we take some questions from all of you, we'll be wrapping up towards the end of the hour. We'll ask you to answer a second poll. Here are some closing remarks from our speakers before we sign off. So without further ado, let me introduce each of our three speakers. We're very delighted. Thank you to all of you for having accepted our invitation to join us today. We have Ambassador Frank Tressler Zamorano, who is the permanent representative of Chile to the United Nations here in Geneva. He has been a diplomat for almost 3 decades, serving in a number of different capacities for the government of Chile, including quite recently working on disarmament and international security affairs. And he has also taught international law at the universities in Santiago, and is also a widely published author. We also have Madame Michèle Boccoz, who's the Director General's Envoy for Multilateral Affairs with the World Health Organization, who is also a diplomat. Previously, she worked for the French government. She was the ambassador for HIV/AIDS and communicable diseases, and has a long history of having worked on health in her role, including strengthening the international health regulations. 2 diplomats so far. Our third guest is Mr. Björn Kümmel, who is the Deputy Head of the Division of Global Health at the Ministry of Health of Germany, and is also the Vice Chair of the WHO Executive Board. He's been working for over 2 decades on WHO. He's probably one of the world's foremost experts on the governance of the organization, having seen it very much from the inside, and he is a lawyer by training. I have to say it's unusual to be in a global health event where we have no medical doctors, and perhaps as a sign of the way the field is evolving, and that would include myself. So welcome to all of our guests. Before diving into our reflections today, I just wanted to remind people of what, in fact, is the Executive Board. So the Executive Board is, of course, one of the key governing bodies of the World Health Organization. In a normal year, it would meet twice. It would meet in January, and it would meet in May. Of course, 2020 has been anything but a normal year, and occasionally the Executive Board will hold special sessions to address specific and urgent topics such as COVID-19. Arguably, the original vision of the Executive Board is that it would be quite distinct from the World Health Assembly. It would play more of a management role. It's comprised of 34 member states versus almost 200 that would participate in the Assembly. And the idea is that it would focus much more tightly on oversight, accountability, and management of the organization. Some have argued that in recent years, it has actually become more of a mini World Health Assembly, where you have not only the Executive Board members, but in fact many other member states who wish to make interventions, and certainly we saw this earlier this week. There are many, many other governments also very actively participating, and it's, in a way, it's a snapshot. It's a way of understanding more broadly what are the concerns of a number of different countries around the world. So without further ado, I'm going to ask that we activate our first poll and give you all an opportunity to let us know As our audience joining us from different regions around the world, how well is international cooperation working to address the COVID-19 pandemic? You can be very optimistic, very well, thank goodness. So, there's room to do better, or very poorly. What a disaster. And we'll give you, I think, less than 30 seconds, or about 30 seconds to respond. And then our expert panelists can have an idea of where all of you are coming from, even before we get to the Q&A. Here we go. Okay, a lot of centrists with us today. Very useful to know, and not too many optimists. All right, so without further ado, let me turn to Mr. Kümmel to address, in your capacity as Vice Chair of the Executive Board, to address my first question, which is regarding, in fact, how well is the EB functioning in its oversight role? We had one member state who was, in fact, arguing that it's not doing so well. And I'd like to hear whether you agree with this critique. Does it have any merit? And what are the priority areas in which the EB could improve?
So thanks a lot for the question. My clear view is that I fully share the view that it was expressed by many EB member states, actually also by the EU through my statement. I believe that the EB has so far not performed its oversight role adequately in this greatest global health crisis in the past 100 years. To be honest, it practically didn't have a role at all until the special session. So it was time to have the board being convened. Is it strange that the board didn't play a crucial role until now? Yes, certainly. And the reason for that is, as you mentioned, WHO is more than the secretariat. It's a member state driven organization. That's something to some extent not understood, I think, in the general public, or not known, and sometimes by member states even denied to some extent that they are part of this organization. We are driving this organization. If we are looking at the pillars of this organization, the first are the member states with the Assembly 194, and the second is the board with the 34 member states, and the third is finally the secretariat with the DG, as written in the constitution, being the chief administrative and technical officer. And that's it. So practically, if there's a problem about WHO, we are part of the problem as member states, and we have to be also part of the solution. And this is why I think it's important that the board plays a crucial role also in addressing this major crisis. It hasn't done so. It has lots of opportunities to provide its oversight and guidance, and also to steer the secretariat in this crisis and to safeguard the secretariat against the criticism coming from the outside world. I think that the current composition of the board is quite interesting. We have India as the chair of the board. We have Chile present here, Germany, Kenya, and many others. But there are also Russia, China, and the US on the board. So it's a very interesting composition currently, geopolitically, very, very interesting. And I think that this insight and this role could have used much better by the board itself. So it's not a criticism towards the secretariat, but the board needs to be enabled to play this role. Even before COVID, the board did not really fulfill its oversight role as foreseen in the constitution. This certainly needs to change. And therefore, the EB special session on Monday and Tuesday decided there was a strong consensus that we should do something about this. We should clarify with ourselves where we see and how we want to perform this oversight role. And we want to hold a retreat as soon as that's possible again, in order to see how we can improve the situation for the future.
Great, thank you so much. Ambassador Tressler, let me turn to you, because you're also, of course, a member of the Executive Board, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on Mr. Kümmel's views of how well the EB has been performing. But one other issue that was raised by many, many different member states was regarding access to vaccines, diagnostics, and drugs in the context of COVID. And because Latin America has been one of the regions that has been hit very, very hard by this pandemic, I wanted to also get your thoughts on how well international cooperation has been working overall in addressing these concerns about access to health technologies. I understand Chile has been both a member of the COVAX facility, has joined the COVAX facility, and has also joined the global call to solidarity behind the COVID-19 technology access pool. So if you could respond to the first question about the functioning of the EB, I'd be quite interested. And also the second question about how well has the international system been performing to ensure that all countries can access health technologies?
Thank you very much. Regarding the first question about how it's been functioning, the EB, I might agree with what's been said by Mr. Kümmel. I think we could improve the functioning. Some countries requested a meeting of the EB, I think in April, and we are in October and we're just meeting. So it's been around 6 months without a meeting in the most complex scenario in the health, area. And sometimes I think also the format of the EB should be changed. When I hear the EB, I hear a lot of speeches prepared from their capitals, a lot of time wasted, 1.5 days maybe, hearing ourselves, because probably, and there's not much interaction or really pointing out the topics that we should be discussing, and a real interaction. So I think it's a problem in the multilateral area that we should be solving, because entering your second question, this pandemic probably is different in a way that we have a different scenario internationally. Pandemics in the past were dealt naturally because borders were borders. Nowadays, we don't have the borders that we used to have 50, 100 years ago, 500 years ago. We have globalization, we have a digital information area. Viruses can be transported from one country to another, very, very fast. So there's no natural. So we need more cooperation, we need more interaction, and for that we need to strengthen, the global health institutions that we have. They play a major role in the past, but they need to adapt to the new circumstances. And I think the executive board is one of it. So I agree a lot with what was proposed by Austria of having an informal session meeting, a kind of retire, where we can discuss about what are the real issues that we should be talking about in order to transform this architecture that we have. In order of our region, we are part of COVAX. We believe that this pandemic and the future pandemics must be dealt with solidarity, with cooperation. And there are public goods, the vaccines, especially for this for this pandemic and for the next ones, must be dealt considering as really public goods. Must be should have access equitable and fair to everybody. It doesn't matter if they are richer or poorer the countries, and we must assure that. And that's why we celebrate the COVAX initiative. It has in there in the main idea of the COVAX is precisely work with solidarity and assure 20% of the vaccines to the main population, in risk. That's what I feel, and I think a lot of people nowadays are dealing with this pandemic probably are thinking the same. And that's why maybe the results of your pool, in a way, they feel we can do better, and we own them that. There's another important thing about this multilateral organization. When we got into this pandemic, and not only we got it in a different scenario with globalization, with digital and information, era, but also we have a very, the society had changed. And there was a lot of questioning about how multilateral was working and how was in a way solving the problems and the needs of the citizens, you know. And in a way, we need to get closer these institutions to the people. Sometimes I feel that we are talking about friends, that we are talking about people with a different language, that what people really are and people in the street, they don't understand when we are talking sometimes. And we need to try to explain better the things of what we do to the society. That's.
I think certainly that's one of the reasons we also welcome participation in these events and try to demystify a bit some of these processes in Geneva for a broader community. Let me turn to Madame Boccoz. I'm not going to ask you how well you think your executive board is functioning. I will turn instead to ask you about another topic that was a preoccupation, I would say, of a number of different member states during the EB, which was the sustainability of funding to WHO. This was something that was included in, of course, the resolution passed back in May 73.1. A number of member states argued that it's very important to make the funding more sustainable and reliable. But has anything changed concretely in the months since the WHA in May? Are governments more willing to fund WHO in a different way? Is there a need to go further?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation to participate in this discussion, which I think is extremely interesting already. And thank you for the question. Yes, we have seen changes, many changes in the way member states and partners engage with WHO over the last few months. Well, for example, we launched what we call the SPRP, the WHO Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan for COVID-19. And it has been very well funded. I mean, there was an immediate response and immediate support from many, many member states. And we have received more than $1.5 billion, received or pledged by almost 70 pledged by almost 70 donors. So there's a very, very broad, probably broader scope of donors than we normally have. We also worked with the UN Foundation, and we raised more than $220 million through the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund from more than 500,000 individual companies and philanthropic institutions, which is really quite new. At the same time, more countries and partners have increased their regular budget contributions to WHO, for example, Germany or the UK, the European Commission, China, Saudi Arabia, Sweden, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and many others, the UK and others. So that's a very important sign as well. What is important also is that during the discussions with the EB, among the proposals for WHO reform, there are proposals into having more stable and more predictable funding for WHO through an increased for assessed contribution. And I think that is also contributions that are really fully flexible, that are fully predictable. And this is also something that I think is a very important move. Having said that, we still need to have a bit more of a breakthrough to enable the organization to expand its work once the pandemic is over. If I look for the moment at the base segment of our budget, it's at the moment for this biennium, we have 2 years budget. So this biennium, at this particular stage of the biennium, is not funded as much as it was in the previous period, which of course we can understand, but we would still need quite a bit to manage to get to that level. So even though there's been a lot of support, we still have some concerns. And among the other challenges, I mean, obviously there's the fact that some programs are traditionally underfunded. And strangely enough, one of the underfunded programs is the Emergency Preparedness Program, which is so important because we see that preparedness and more funding in preparedness would have avoided a lot of the current crisis in having both the organization and also country level better prepared. So we think that this is something that really urgently needs to change. But there are other sectors. I mean, I won't go into all the details at this stage. We still rely on a relatively small number of donors beyond the SPRP. And there again, there's a bit of lack of predictability, and we would like to engage again further with member states. And I think that is part of the discussions we have. So basically, we are very happy with the mobilization that has been around COVID. I think it shows that there's an understanding of the urgency of that, but we probably need to integrate that more in the long term. And I'm really happy to see that some of the papers that have been circulated at EB level take that dimension into consideration. And I would really like to thank the member states that are bringing this vision and bringing the support to more predictability, more sustainability, and more capability in the end for the organization to fully play its role.
Indeed. This has been, I think, one of the key debates for many years, actually, whenever the question of WHO reform comes up, and that question comes up every few years, it seems. So this is a very nice way to segue back, in fact, to Ambassador Tressler, because Chile is one of the countries that has put forward reform proposals. Of course, other countries have also done so. France and Germany have a joint proposal, the US, the Republic of Korea, and I'm sure there are others that I'm not even aware of. Is there a lot of agreement between governments on what are the priorities for reform? Where is there agreement? And where would you say there are outliers or a divergence of views? You know, what are going to be the tough differences that need to be bridged, overcome, if there's actually going to be concrete progress on reform?
Thank you very much. Probably we all agree that we need to improve our response for future pandemics. The thing that we haven't yet met is in what we should improve, and that's why we're working on it. But we started very ambitious. We wanted to start probably thinking about reforming in the areas that must be reformed, the international health regulation. But at the end, we prefer with other countries to give some general ideas of the areas that we think that should be improved. And that's why we gave a document, a paper to Dr. Tedros, to the panel, and also to the committee, the review committee. And in that sense, we identify certain areas that we should explore. And the countries should agree to. First of all, I think we should, for future improvement, for a future health protection architecture, we should look also to a better way to protect the most vulnerable people. We saw it in this pandemic with the elder people, you know, and we should see how we can improve that protection to the most vulnerable. The second one is to strengthen the intersectoral coordination and communication in order to detect and prevent, you know, pandemics. We always can improve the way we work, and I think that this is the time where we can work on that. The third one is we saw a lot of problems in the movement of goods, medical goods, and also in persons, you know, transit of persons. Persons weren't allowed to travel to their home countries. We had emergencies with refugees, with migrants in the borders, how to handle them. Countries closed their borders to their own citizens even. So it's something that we should discuss. There are a couple of other good ideas maybe on board that we can talk about. For example, the implementation of intermediate levels of alerts, and also a peer review mechanism, you know, among countries, as other organizations have. But the main problem probably will be that all the legal framework that we have, it relies on the voluntary willingness of the countries to do it. They're not mandatory, in a way. There are a few things that are really mandatory, because countries are very reluctant to give up, you know, sovereignty or issues in this matter. So it's a thing that we should talk with countries. How much are we willing to give up? Because at the end, if we want to especially in this time where I must remark, we don't have borders for viruses. There are no countries for viruses. You know, one virus that is in Chile today could be, you know, in Europe in 10 hours, in a flight of 10 hours. So countries must be more willing, you know, to agree, you know, to give certain sovereignty rights in order to be able to to control in a more coordinated. If we want to coordinate this in a higher level, we need to give some power to that coordination stage.
If I may just follow up briefly on that, I mean, technically speaking, the international health regulations are binding, but I understand you have a background in security. You come from the international security and disarmament field. Is the problem whether they're mandatory, or is it a problem of compliance? And how can we envision, in fact, how we might improve compliance? I mean, this does get down to the sovereignty question that you raised.
It's very complicated, to be honest, especially in this time where we see global international scenario more polarized. You know, countries are less willing to talk about certain issues because it's crossed by bilateral, you know, problems among themselves. And I see it here, I see it in the Human Rights Council, I see it everywhere, you know, in a way it's contaminated. The discussion is contaminated by bilateral, you know, problems, rather than looking in an approach of a more globalized or multilateral approach.
Very difficult political divisions to overcome then, even if there's agreement on some of the specific proposals, which I think is a nice segue to turn over to you, Mr. Kümmel. You spoke in your one of your interventions about the importance of urgency, and that the window of opportunity to actually push forward some reforms is finite. Are we moving quickly enough? We heard lots of requests from member states to open up the independent panel process, for example, to have more consultation, to have more member state involvement. We heard that it won't report fully until May. There are other reasons, of course, geopolitical reasons why it might be difficult to get agreement. Are we going to be able to move fast enough? And or have we perhaps even already lost some of the urgency and the momentum?
Great question, which I will answer in 1 second. I just want to refer to the question before. Is there a lot of agreement, or where will we reach agreement? And I've now covered WHO for 10 years, not 2 decades, but 1 decade. And I've seen lots of reform debates. And it was always easy for us to decide on changes that the Secretariat would have to implement. But we were always very bad in changes that we would have to implement as member states. And that will be exactly the same here again. Now to the main question of urgency. That's tricky. So first of all, I think at some stage also, and the COVID resolution of the Assembly in May is also a result of that. We wanted to make sure that we start a process, but we wouldn't infringe on the response. So we are still in the midst of the largest global health crisis, and we wouldn't want to make sure, well, we want to make sure that WHO is positioned well in order to cover this response and wouldn't have to start internal debates on reforming. So that's one aspect, which I think the various panels will take care of, because we expect the results to come in May. Is that quick enough? Is that maybe not quick enough? If we are, for example, looking at the IHR Review Committee, this is not the first time that we had an IHR Review Committee. However, the last one was established after the Ebola crisis, and it took 1.5 years until they came up with recommendations. Now, the current one is supposed to come up with recommendations during the crisis and practically only in half a year. So this is quite ambitious on the one hand. And many member states say, so let's wait until May and let's discuss in May the outcome of the various panels. That's one approach. I would say on the German side, we would clearly say that we need to see the outcome, but that shouldn't refrain us from bringing in and starting debating various reform proposals now. Why? Because there is, to some extent, the sense of urgencies. One point, I have 3 points. The first one is WHO reform has been on the agenda even before COVID. So this is nothing new. It was ongoing before. The second one is there's certainly no time to lose. Why? All the proposals that are currently on the table, some of them are in the German-French paper, some of them are in the Chilean paper, some in the Korean paper, in the US paper, and in the many papers to come. They are not new. They are all known from former lessons learned processes, Ebola crisis, for example. But there's a reason why they have never been implemented so far. And the reason is that these recommendations came out when the global focus from this health crisis had shifted already to the next crisis. After COVID, there will be a next global crisis. It might not, hopefully will not be a health crisis. And once that focus shifts, the political momentum is gone, and the willingness of member states to really implement ambitious and bold recommendations will shift. And we need to, well, take that political momentum that we see currently, and hopefully we create currently, for bold decisions to be taken at some stage. So we really need to engage now in the debates, and we have to exchange the best ideas, creative ideas, how to improve the situation. My third point, and that was true before COVID and will be true after COVID. While it's not clear when the next global health crisis will strike us, it's very clear that the next global health crisis will strike us even after COVID. COVID is not the security that in a year's time or 2 years' time from now, there will not be the next outbreak of a new virus deadly as COVID or even more. So we better make sure that we really learn the lessons from this crisis to be best prepared. And I think that we owe to, well, our countries, but also obviously to the general public. We really have to do an effort to change and to reflect on every stone that we see, turn it around and check, is it worth changing something? And certainly we are in for changing business as usual.
Thank you so much. I'd like to come back to that, but let me turn and pose a final question to Madame Boccoz. Before I do that, I just wanted to flag to our participants that you can enter your questions in the Q&A box. And for our panelists, you can have a quick look there. We'll turn to the Q&A immediately after this, this question. So, Madame Boccoz, I think Mr. Kümmel very astutely pointed out that it's much easier for member states to agree on changes that you, as a secretariat, need to make, rather than those that member states themselves need to make. What are some of those changes? What are the changes that are either already underway, as Dr. Tedros mentioned, or that you think can reasonably be put in place, given that indeed the window of time, the window of time for change, the political clock doesn't always run at the same speed as the institutional clock for all of these reform reviews, right? The independent panel, the HR review committee, the IOAC, and perhaps others. But if you could give us some of your reflections on what you heard at the EB, what are some changes you think are really a priority for the Secretariat? And on the other hand, what are those which are really out of your hands? They really do sit at the member state level. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I really think that to answer your question, what is the time? When is the time for change? It's now. I mean, we absolutely must use the momentum and the attention to do it right now. And as was alluded to already by you and by the other panelists, WHO's transformation is an ongoing process. I think our DG was very clear that we started this transformation. He started the transformation when he was elected. That was his mandate, also to transform the organization. And many things have already been done, but that's not enough. And we must carry on, we must continue. And we must also make sure that we learn the lessons and that we transform the organization in the way it needs to be done. So of course it has addressed, the current transformation has already addressed a number of key institutional dimensions to strengthen the world of the organization in relation with our model. I mean, we are strengthening, for example, the country-based work. We think that it's really so important that we work at country level to make a difference. Also to focus on health emergency preparedness, which was one of the outcomes of the reform, to create a specific division that would be working on that. Also developing the partnerships, because we know that it's very important that we work much more broadly, of course, with our member states, but also more broadly with also civil society, with other non-state actors, and that we engage. Multilateral engagements also are very important, and we've been playing more of a role working in that, and improving our work on norms and standards. And I'd like to flag the creation of the science division in terms of quality of norms and standards, and also the WHO Academy, which will mean which will aim at helping member states in implementing those changes. So that's a whole process that we are working on. Of course, we work a lot more with other partners as well. And I would like to talk about the One Health approach, for example, for zoonotic diseases, where we work particularly with FAO and OIE, and perhaps we need to add more partners. I would like to mention also an initiative that was launched by Germany, Norway, and Ghana on bringing together the partners for implementation of SDG 3, the SDG 3 Global Action Plan, where we work in a much more integrated and more collaborative approach. And that is really part of our approach. But basically our vision is that if we want to change, if we want to solve, and if we want to have a different vision, we have to have a whole of government and whole of society approach. And that's the key message that we drew from COVID, that is so essential. So it means that there is also a part of the reforms that must be member state led. I mean, including the reform in their own countries. If we look at what are the gaps, for example, in pandemic preparedness, we were asked by the G20 to do a report on that and to try and analyze where the gaps were. Some of the gaps are global, some of the gaps are also national. And I think that we as an organization can help address the global ones and also need to help member states in the transformation. But I think there's a need also of putting into place the mechanisms for pandemic preparedness with this whole of government approach. And we see so much with the pandemic, the impact for trade, the impact for finance, for economy, for agriculture, for environment, and many others. So that's this kind of approach that we really need to develop together. And then, of course, there's always the question of cost at country level. But we did an analysis that shows that the investment into preparedness is such a fraction of the 10 trillion that have been spent for the moment into trying to get the economy, to keep the economy floating, that this is something that would probably have to be considered. Then obviously there's a number of decisions to change in the organization that are member state led. We are a member state driven organization, and member state needs to make decisions. For example, in the IHR, we've convened the IHR review committee that will certainly come forward with ideas, proposals that will have to be decided by also member states. In terms of what do we do? Do we need to review the IHR? There's of course the question that you raised a moment ago about the implementation of IHR, and I think that's also extremely important to make sure that everybody is well positioned to implement the IHR, and that we have this transparency, these discussions, that we have this interaction together. So that is certainly a very important issue. But basically, yes, we need to have this interaction with our member states' guidance in how to move that forward and how to work collectively together to do that. And I'm really optimistic, and I'm glad that we had such good discussions at the EB level, that there were those many proposals and many reflections that have been made into how can we move it forward together. Because basically, if we want to be much better prepared in the future, not only for preparedness for pandemic, but also preparedness in terms of strengthening health system, addressing the vulnerable populations, making sure we take care of those who need it. We need to have a sort of this broader vision.
Thank you very much, Madame Boccoz. I want to open the floor up to our audience for Q&A. You can see we've already had a number of questions coming in, and I wanted to actually turn first to Mr. Kümmel for a very basic question, which is the criticism of WHO that has emerged over the last several months, is it justified? This comes to us from, you can all see in the Q&A. Miriam Hirschfeld.
Okay, a big question, and I guess we will find out also in the overall review process. I'm not sure whether I'm best positioned to answer that, because certainly there are diverging views also, in larger administrations. I think what I hear from the experts who are really experts for health emergencies, they practically say WHO has learned much from past crises. It has already implemented, and the emergency program is fit and running. It has reacted quite quickly. It has communicated on the information that it received. So at least what I hear from my experts, it sounds as if the sometimes harshly perceived criticism that I at least wouldn't share that. Over.
Thank you so much. Let me turn Ambassador Tressler to you. We have a number of additional questions coming in, but there was a question raised earlier by Jonas Lastens, I believe, about whether some of the multilateral cooperation that we have seen arguably revived in the health arena. Do you see the possibility of that spilling over into other issue areas, into other crises? I think you also highlighted a number of the geopolitical divisions that that we still see.
It's very difficult. It's like science fiction, you know, trying to predict what's going to happen. But when the pandemic started, I remember I thought, well, this is the opportunity the world has in order to shape a better way of coordination, of solidarity, of cooperation. Probably the countries will leave aside their, you know, selfish interests in order to create a more global, you know, approach. Sadly, may I say that now that we can say we're in the middle of finishing, I don't know if finishing, but because they're talking about the second wave, but I haven't seen that process as clear as I thought it was going to be. I think we still are in the multilateral area. The countries are still talking about their own interests. They are talking. They are reluctant in order to give up, you know, certain interests in order to construct a better architecture, multilateral architecture. It's sad to say we have. I thought we were going to learn with this pandemic and the toll that has left us and is going to keep leaving us, but. I don't know. I think humans adapt very fast, and I hope when this finish, we won't see business as usual. We see a different kind of business and a different kind of an approach, and that also in the area of the health, you know, the World Health System.
Indeed, very difficult to predict the future, especially after this year. I think many of us will stop trying. Let me turn, Madame Boccoz, to you, because you were emphasizing the importance of what member states need to do in terms of strengthening health systems. And this was really the first thing you mentioned, WHO's work on the ground and its ability or its mission to support at least some member states in terms of strengthening its health systems. We had a question coming from Nick Darabos from Croatia about the specific role of the WHO Academy, because I think it's clear also from your earlier comments that WHO cannot single-handedly, of course, address all of these weaknesses that we've seen exposed in COVID-19. Is the Academy a new way in which it can try to support countries beyond sending teams, beyond sending equipment or trying to raise money? How do you see the role of the Academy, the WHO Academy in particular?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Yes, of course, strengthening health systems is absolutely at the core of a better health for everybody. Solidarity, preparedness, everything is there. So our role is also to help at country level, and I would remind that we have 150 country offices, especially in countries with weaker health system or more fragile health systems. So we're really trying to be there, to be present, to assist, and to be there on a constant basis. What's the role of the Academy? I mean, basically, we produce a lot of norms and standards. That is our work, and our norms and standards are in fact the best practices in health. And we're trying to give countries the best possible tools to strengthen their health systems. But our norms and standards take, in an average, about 10 years before they are implemented, because they are complex, because they're numerous, and because there's a need also to play our role with countries to help them put them into practice. So DG Tedros has decided that we needed to create a new function, to bring together all the training and in particular the adult learning we do within the organization. We do a lot. We do about 1,500 or 400 courses per year. but we targeted them more on topics. What the Academy is going to do is we need to change the way we're going to work with countries. And we want to work much more on the competence basis and on the person-centered approach. We want to look at what a person needs to deliver and to help deliver the best norms and standards and to be at the best standards of quality. And so we're looking at a much more personalized approach where we're looking at people's competencies and helping them thanks to new technologies. So we're building this academy on using the cutting edge new techniques for adult learning, using the new technologies such as artificial intelligence that allow us to be much more focused on what a person needs and to also try to train persons in their different capacities. We're going to train people from politicians, policymakers, the district medical officers, the community workers, the private sector when they are delivering services. I mean, all kinds of partners to help deliver health at country level. And we're trying to also consider what a person needs, which might be as a politician, might be also as a doctor, might be as a mother or a father, somebody engaged in community projects. And so we're trying to have a much more holistic vision of health. But basically the role of the Academy is really to help countries deliver, to be really a game changer in making sure that the best practices are brought at country level and can really make a difference for people's life, and particularly the most vulnerable people.
Thank you. I think big plans and big hopes for this this particular initiative, certainly. There was a question addressed specifically to Mr. Kümmel from Thomas Schwartz of Medicus Mundi regarding the functioning of the EB. And he labeled the meetings as ceremonial. And I think Ambassador Tressler, you also agreed with that earlier. And Thomas Schwartz basically asks, how realistic is it? What can the EB do, in fact, to pull more of its weight and act as a counterweight? Let me see if I can get the words right. A strong counterpart, excuse me, not counterweight. Does EB have the potential and the support from member states to provide real leadership and be a strong counterpart to the Secretariat?
Interesting, the counterpart, because in fact, and I think I tried to explain that the WHO is a member state-driven organization. So in fact, it's less a counterpart, but certainly the EB is the driving force, and the Secretariat is the following one. Yeah.
In theory.
In theory, exactly. But well, I think much depends on whether the individual members of the board really well try to exercise this role together with the others. I think one of the key issues, certainly, and you've mentioned that already, is that the board has become a small assembly, a show in front of everybody else. And I think if we are talking about multilateralism and strengthening the role of multilateralism, we have to strengthen the governance structures that we currently have, or at least, and use them in the right foreseen way, which we are currently not doing. I think much of that is, and I think Ambassador has already alluded to that, is that people read out prepared statements. There's practically almost no interaction, which is not how a board should normally function, but we should rather interact with one another. We should more set the agenda and not let the Secretariat, which obviously also has its interests, set the agenda. So I think that would be the way how we would want to see the board functioning in the future. And we are willing to play our parts. I think much depends on the willingness of members of the board to engage with one another. And I see that some regions, I would say, are more outspoken than other regions. That's also a problem in the board. And when I entered the board, what I tried to do is that the board members themselves get to know each other. So we invited everybody to a restaurant. We did that 2 or 3 times. Not everybody came, in order to build up the trust among board members first. And then the second part that we certainly also would have to build up is the trust vis-a-vis the rest, because we also heard that at the last board meeting, that even the request to hold a retreat where only the board members would meet was countered by some who said this has to be fully inclusive, everybody has to be at the table. But then that's not a board anymore. Yeah, so I think I would at least be be a fan of having a real retreat where the board members themselves discuss, yeah, among board members. So I hope that answers a little bit the question.
Thanks very much. Ambassador Tressler, let me turn to you, and we're coming very, very quickly to the end of our hour. But there was a question from Olaf Wienczak about assessed contributions to WHO, which is, I think, an issue that has come up again over and over and over again, but I think is really certainly one of the key issues that has to be addressed in reform. And Olaf asks about whether there's a critical mass of support from member states for this kind of reform. And I would be interested in hearing your views as a representative of Chile. What have you heard from other countries in your region or elsewhere in the world? Is this something that you have debated and considered?
No, thank you. In order to understand the issue of contributions, that is something that probably is the same for other institutions, international institutions. Domestically, we have changed. Our governments are not nowadays have to respond to citizens that have more power, are empowered, and they want to see results. I know that if you want to give $1 million, $20 million to an organization, you have to prove them, you know, that it's worthy, that is going to have direct impact in their lives. And that's something that probably the international organizations have to start working on. We need to convince our constituencies that the international organizations are important, they are delivering, and they have a direct impact in their daily life. And that's something that we have to start working together with other countries, with the international organizations. And yes, going back to the question that was answered by Mr. Kümmel, I must agree also the executive board must change the way it's working. I think in a way to be more interactive, less speeches, control more the agenda, and try to be more productive at the end, to have concrete results to show in order to function as it should be properly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to direct one last question to Madame Boccoz before we ask our audience to weigh in on a survey. I'm really torn between two, but let me pose the one from Tabitha Ha regarding civil society. And she asks, how can civil society be more engaged and involved in the global governance of the response to COVID? I should highlight that some civil society groups have expressed disappointment and displeasure that they were not allowed to speak during the EB, and that the website that hosted their statements actually went down during the EB. Are we seeing a closing of space or room for civil society to engage? There have also been, I should recall, critiques by civil society groups that they've been excluded from a number of the ACT Accelerator governing discussions and decisions. What is the take from the Secretariat in terms of avenues for involvement of civil society?
We absolutely want to engage with civil society. They are absolutely key players at grassroots level where we really need to make a difference and where we really need to change. So I think it's extremely important we do. Of course, we've said several times in this discussion, we're a member state-driven organization, but we still have provision to engage with civil society. And I would like to underline that there is a very, very strong will from our Director General, Dr. Tedros, to really engage with civil society, and he's done so in a way that's, in my view, completely unprecedented. And we need to carry on this discussion. So, of course, they need to be able to speak more and to be more able to express their way in an interactive manner in governance matters. We've had some reflections on that. We were trying to look at reforms processes. And there were some ongoing discussion on how to make sure that there can be, let us say, a really useful interaction in the sense that that would come at a time where there would be proposal that can be taken into account, or how to make it work. So this is reflection that is going on that will, of course, need to be approved by our governance. But I think that there's been already some ideas floating around for quite some time that have been discussed. DG has also instituted a number of meetings with civil society in a number of ways, on the disease approach sometimes, also on spotting some areas where we really need to engage more in terms of vulnerable populations, in terms of engaging with women's group, in terms of engaging with some local civil society groupings as well. So there's a number of different initiatives to maintain this dialogue constant, and that they have an input also in when we prepare our programs, when we start working on strategies, and a number of other aspects. So it's really important that we keep that dialogue alive, that we develop it, and we will look, of course, into our member states' guidance, and I know they've already given it a lot of thought in terms of seeing how to make that interaction that was mentioned a number of times today possible also with civil society.
Thank you so much. With that, let me turn to our audience and share the closing poll with you. If we could get, there we go. So after the EB special session and this discussion, how well do you think the COVID-19 evaluation and reform processes are moving ahead? And we have three options again: very well, in the middle, more or less on track, or off track and needs urgent attention. And while we're waiting for our audience, I'll give each of my panelists 30 seconds to prepare 1 minute in terms of what's your single most important conclusion regarding what are the next steps? What are the conclusions you draw from the EB earlier this week? Okay, and we'll take the answers from our three panelists, and then we'll share with you what the audience, how the audience feels. And let me begin in reverse order. We'll go to Madame Boccoz, Ambassador Tressler, and then Mr. Kümmel. One key conclusion.
A very important takeaway for me is the commitment and the very strong positions of member states in relation to the evaluation process. They're very committed to the spirit of solidarity, and I think this word has been mentioned several times in the discussion we have, and very important support for multilateralism and collective action. I think that these are very, very important takeaways for me from this discussion.
Thank you, very concise. Ambassador Tressler? You're still on mute.
To be very brief,
yes,
just let me say there's no more time for business as usual. We need to change the way the EB works. We need more control of the agenda of the states, more transparency, and we need to move fast for reforms of the architecture. We cannot wait 10 more years or 15 more years, because the next pandemics, we don't know when it's going to hit us, if it's going to be a week, 6 months, a year, and we need to learn the lessons of the current pandemic and try to change based on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kümmel?
Could make it very quick. I share every single word that Ambassador Tressler just mentioned, but I will add something. From my point of view, we have to address a key gap that I see, and that is the discrepancy in between member states' expectation vis-a-vis WHO and WHO's given abilities to fulfill these expectations. And to put it in even stronger words, there's a major discrepancy in between how member states praise the importance of WHO and what they are willing to provide for WHO. And that needs to be addressed in this lessons learned process.
Thank you. Let's see what our audience had to say about how the evaluation and reform process is moving. We could get the poll results. There we go. Okay, so very few and the very well. and more or less divided between so-so and off-track, needs urgent attention. Let's hope this distribution of opinions changes over the coming months. With that, let me close our event and begin by thanking each of our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your insights in a frank and open manner with us. Thank you to the audience for your engagement and your questions. We are recording and will post this webinar afterwards. And I apologize, we couldn't get to all of the questions, but certainly we take your questions into account for organizing future events, and we'll also make them available together with the webinar recording. Let me just flag for all of you some of the upcoming events that we have on the calendar. As you can see on the screen, we have a research event, we have the launch of a new initiative on digital health, we have an event, a third event next week on real and fake data in global health. All of them, I think, will be very eye-opening discussion, so I hope you'll be able to join us. Two more quick comments before I close. One, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Elisa Codato, Nora Sada, and Sachio Yagi in particular, for making this event possible. And finally, in a first for this webinar series, we will have a post-event survey. So I hope for those of you who can spare 90 seconds of your time, you'll give us some quick feedback. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you to our speakers, and stay healthy and stay safe, everybody.